This morning, our first speaker is Kieran Kunhya from Open Broadcast Systems. And he's going to be talking about timestamps in ST2110, what they mean, and how to measure them. And it's a very interesting topic, and I hope you all pay attention. Thanks.
Thanks, Wes, and thanks for organizing all of this. Lots of hard work going into that. So usually I do a quick company introduction. What our company does is we specialize in software-based encoders and decoders for sports, news, and channel contribution, so B2B. We're based in central London. Throughout the pandemic, I used to point to my left and say Big Ben is over there, so you're going to have to imagine Big Ben is over there. There's actually probably quite a lot going on over there right now. We build everything in-house, hardware, firmware, software, everything. We built a full 2110 stack ourselves in-house. There are no third-party components entirely in our products, so we've done NMOS, timestamps, everything, you name it. Also not to be confused with the other OBS, the free web streaming product. So this presentation, there's going to be a lot to it, but I've tried to make it at least approachable to someone in the field. If you want easy, at NAB I gave a presentation called How to Explain ST2110 to a 6-year-old. Introductory, don't need to have any major background knowledge. On the other hand, if someone like Thomas Kieran or Willem was talking about PTP or ST2110 or EBU list, where they really go into the guts of it all, I've tried to put this into medium hard. So I will try to introduce the topic, but there will be some maths. By all means, and also this won't try and explain everything in its fullest detail, because there isn't really that time for that. Some level of basic mathematical analysis, and we can discuss afterwards things in much more detail. So what am I going to talk about today? Why do we need timestamps? PTP, very, 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 very abridged. The RTP timestamp calculation. Timestamps versus packet arrival times, giant pet peeve of mine, not the same thing. Measurements, including some real measurements from our lab. How, at least I think, a receiver should use timestamps. Others may differ, and where and why these things go wrong. So why do we need timestamps? As many of you know, in 2110, video and audio are sent as different flows, and they are raw data. We don't know what... Oh, and obviously, as a result, receivers can subscribe to only the flows they need. So audio devices don't need to subscribe to high bandwidth video or ancillary or bits they don't need. And this audio and video is raw across the network from various sources and points in time. And we need to be able to synchronize this also. That player there, when he's kicking the football, it needs to actually kick the football at the right time and make the right sound. And so what we use in 2110 are timestamps to do this. And the receiver goes and uses these to match them up. So the kick of the ball sounds like a kick of a ball, and not too late or not too early. And they really correspond to a given instant of capture. So at least for video, all packets of a video frame or field, they have the same timestamp, which is a bit different to how things were done historically. My super, super, super abridged version of PTP. So as you all know, we split audio and video up into thousands of little packets. And what we do is kind of imagine that all television started at the same time. So frames, audio was all started at the 1st of January 1970. Obviously, that wasn't the case. We didn't have a time machine to send 2110 back in the past and start, but we assume it happened. And so each video frame and field lasts a number of clock ticks. So we start from the 1st of January 1970, and that's known as the PTP epoch. And 52 years later, there is a time with that n number of frames later. That time, the beginning of said frame on the right is the PTP alignment point. I really hate that word. I wish I could come up with a better word for it. It's annoying to use. It's annoying to write PTP alignment point in code, etc. And so now, for example, if I wanted to start sending, I have to wait until the next PTP alignment point. Then I start sending my 2110, and therefore all of the streams in my facility are matched up. They start at the same time. So let's look at the timestamp calculation in RTP. And that on the right is what's known as an RTP header. And we use the PTP clock in its the PTP alignment point clock value in its timestamp header. So unfortunately, it's a 32-bit value, and it has different clock rates. So 90 kilohertz clock for video and 48 kilohertz for audio. This means the video timestamp wraps after 13 hours for 13 hours for video and 25 hours for audio. So that's a bit like where an old-fashioned tachometer in your car goes round and wraps around to 0 again. That's a big problem because it needs to be thought. You have to be very careful when you do calculations. Other challenges, when you have a 59.94 stream in the US, that's not divisible by 90 kilohertz, so you have to be really careful when implementing this. So my maths teacher was obsessed with worked examples. We did worked examples for weeks on end. So the shoe is now on the other foot, and I'm giving a worked example, I don't know, 15 years later. So let's pick an arbitrary date, midnight, for the astronomical time. So this is time that doesn't have jumps in it, so no leap seconds. If you go back to the ST2110 for 6-year-olds, I go into what leap seconds are. And I've tried to make things simple by not using fractional frame rates. So what we do, we go and work out how many clock ticks there were. So 1,944 days times 8,6400 seconds in a day times 90,000, which is the clock rate. We divide that by 25 frames per second, and then we multiply it by 25 frames per second again. So that gives us the previous alignment point to now, or to that time point. So you get this large value here. I'll point out these values are very large. When implementing it in software, you can get overflow. I think you have to go to 128-bit intermediates. I must admit, I got this wrong several times in the process of writing this presentation, and my colleagues had to go and fix it. So it's tricky. So you take that value, and then you do a mod 2 to the power 32. So that gives you your RTP timestamp. That might be wrong, actually, but I think it's right. And it's been checked by a couple of people, but I stand corrected. It is tricky. You have to order your operations correctly, and especially more care is needed when you do fractional frame rates, because you have to have intermediates and then do divisions after the intermediates instead of before. Otherwise, you don't have the right precision, etc., etc. It's very headache-inducing. But these timestamps are not the same as packet arrival times. Most facilities will use what's known as gapped mode, and there's plenty of presentations that talk about the intricacies of gap mode, where historical blanking data used to be. And this basically means the first packet arrives broadly 600, 700 microseconds after the beginning of the frame or field, after the PTP alignment point. And as I'll show you in a minute, some scopes don't at all make this very clear what time they're referring to. Sometimes it's hidden in a different menu. Sometimes you have to expand the little window to see both of them. And I'll talk about this later, how it can go wrong. And I think it's really important to understand what you're actually measuring, because I see people say they're measuring one thing, but they're measuring timestamps, so they're measuring packet arrival times. I see people measuring packet arrival times and actually measuring the timestamps. So this is an example of one of the scopes. It's the Prism. I believe to get all of this, you have to actually expand it. You don't actually get it in its default view, which also causes a lot of confusion. So the left is the packet arrival time relative to the PTP alignment point, and the right is the RTP timestamp relative to the PTP alignment point. I must admit, speaking a bit personally, well, I'll mention that a bit later. So either of those could be wrong. Packet arrival time could be wrong relative to the PTP alignment point, or the RTP timestamp could be wrong relative to the PTP alignment point. This is the Fabrics product. Similar thing, a bit more detailed. I must admit, though, I got this wrong in its interpretation, had to read the manual. I assumed doing what I do, not reading the manual, thinking I know what I'm doing, and actually had to go and read the manual to really understand what's going on. There are multiple video timing meters available, packet arrivals and RTP offsets, and some fabrics may not actually have this option, so they may have a reduced version of the screen if they don't have the right measurement license. I mean, speaking personally, I think having had to debug these in an operational environment, both as a vendor or as a vendor going into an end user's network and trying to resolve, personally, I think the Prism is a little bit too vague and the Fabrics is a bit too complicated. And I'll show you a bit later, I'll show you in the next slide. As a result of this, we kind of had to use our own internally built tools to get these measurements over long periods of time. Because some of these measurements don't necessarily stay in the device. If that device needs to be used by someone else, you lose those measurements. So here's some example of some real senders in our lab. Our lab, for various building reasons, doesn't have roof access to get GPS. So in our lab, we pretend it's 1970. So if we look at one of the first sender here, this one is both good. It's got its first packets arrived. Well, I would clarify, I'm not Willem Vermost. I haven't done a full 2110-21 analysis. I've just done the sort of first level, first line support. Let's look at a problem we have in a facility before going into the real nuts and bolts of EBU list and 2110. So first packets arrived 0.758 milliseconds after ideal, and its RTP PTP offset is 0. It's spot on. Both are good, broadly speaking. So the second sender is interesting. Its first packets also arrived reasonably on time. Its RTP's timestamp is also like okay. It's one. So the middle column shows that we're one RTP clock tick out. And here's the third sender in our lab. This one again. First packet arrival time is kind of okay, nothing terrible. Possibly a more detailed 21-21 analysis is needed, but practically probably not the end of the world. But its RTP PTP offset is bad. It's in the past. Packet arrival time is good, but RTP timestamp is bad. And in reality, it needs continual measurement in a real facility, and we see jumps happening overnight and coming back. And there are also similar measurements for audio, a bit simpler than this. Can also be very problematic sometimes of audio equipment. This is where maybe it gets a bit controversial, how I think a receiver should use timestamps. So what a receiver should do is it should take a timestamp, it should work out how many RTP wraparounds there have been from the PTP epoch, and as using that data, it can then realign its received RTP timestamp with the current PTP time and have an absolute timestamp, so essentially converting from a relative timestamp to an absolute timestamp. This sounds quite complicated, but actually ends up boiling down to 1 or 2 lines of code. If you do some modular arithmetic, they're a bit problematic if the timestamps are a bit too far forward or too far in the past. Relatively speaking, high school mathematics. And then a device can once it has gone and realigned its timestamps and has an absolute timestamp that's PTP aligned, it can therefore go and do synchronized video and audio and do what it needs to do downstream. But as you saw before, all of those sources into many devices, even the ones in red, actually work fine. And this basically proves that many of these receivers are not doing this. And we can also, in our lab, generate artificial sources with incorrect timestamps. But we see many receivers work fine. So it's pretty clear that some devices aren't using timestamps. And this is a big challenge in many ways because it allows for timestamps to just run freely in facilities and be wrong and no one notice unless they're really looking at things carefully. Or they're using a receiver which is doing full wraparound and realignment. So where and why do things go wrong? Probably the most common one operationally is when people route non-PTP locked SDI sources into encapsulators, or if that encapsulator lacks a frame synchronizer, so it can't create new frames or drop frames to be PTP aligned. So you often see packet arrival times wrong or jittery. You see attempts by the encapsulator to try and correct for this. The RTP timestamp is often bad. The fix for this is to genlock your source or enable frame sync if available. But sometimes in the field, operational requirements mean people just plug in random devices which are not genlocked and maybe low end enough not to have genlocks. So they have to go and route them into frame syncs. A bit like the old days, to be fair. Or, as in my examples, the encapsulator produces invalid RTP timestamps. Fixed offset, sometimes jumps. I've noticed, for example, some of the more US-based companies haven't tested things as rigorously in Europe and vice versa. So the US frame rates will work perfectly and the European ones may not, and vice versa. And it's quite long and challenging to investigate whether this is a transient issue, you just reboot the device, it comes back, or it's a much more complex inherent issue that you have to go back. There's also some products where you route a signal and it can take a good couple of minutes to settle down and produce a valid timestamp, so it's wrong, and it gradually drifts its timestamp back into being correct. This could also be often difficult, to be fair, for a vendor to reproduce or to explain to a vendor, because very few devices complain. So to conclude, timestamps are a really important part of 2110. Receivers need them to match audio and video. They can be hard to measure and interpret. Certainly, I've been in a facility during the pandemic. mask on, can't breathe, thinking hard, scribbling my notebook. Is my minus sign, does that mean I'm ahead of the alignment point or behind the alignment point? The maths can cause headaches. It's not simple. Timestamps are regularly often confused with packet arrival times. I often see reports where people mean one versus the other. These need to be measured continually. You can have jumps in the middle of the night that can lock you up. They can kick downstream devices out of sync, for example. But it's only maybe a couple of frames or more than a couple of or seconds in the space of, and that jump happened over a day or two. Very important to make sure encapsulators have frame syncs or all sources are gen locked. And it's also important to understand the reasons for these invalid timestamps. There may be all sorts of reasons why. Any questions?
Okay, thank you very much.